Hello, my name is Matthew, and I read The Purloined Letter by Edgar Allan Poe. This is another one of his detective stories starring Monsieur Dupin, and again, it begins with Dupin and his friend sitting in their house in the drawing room, just having a conversation, and there's a knock at the door, and it's the inspector that wants to talk to Dupin. He is baffled by a case that he is currently working on, and they all sit down together. And so we get the inspector who's going to lay out this puzzling situation that the police force have found themselves in. And we learn that there is a letter that was stolen from a very important person, and this letter is damning. If it ever got out, it would ruin this person's career, and it's a very special, important person, so it could have huge ramifications for all sorts of other industries and political figures. So it's a high-stakes letter, and the person that had the letter stolen even knows who took it. It was stolen right in front of them. And the important thing about this letter is that it needs to be immediately accessible, so it could not be put in a random train station at the other end of town. Through a whole series of deductions and explanations that we're given as the reader and the inspector is giving to Dupin, this letter must be in the robber's house. It's not on the robber's person, and it's not anywhere outside of the house. And meanwhile, the police force, for weeks and weeks and weeks, each night, are going into this apartment, this house, and they're taking everything apart silently and methodically with all sorts of scientific inspection and meticulousness. They are checking all of the legs of the furniture to see if they have bore holes for every single book. They open up each leaf looking for the letter. Look at this great description that the police force have checked every single square inch of this house, and the letter is not to be found. And yet, the letter must be in the house. And so this is the puzzle, this baffling dilemma that the inspector has found himself in and has resorted to going to Monsieur Dupin for help. And this is all explained to Dupin, and he says, well, maybe sometimes the most problematic difficult situation is much more simple than you think. And the inspector roars uproariously. And finally the inspector leaves, and Dupin and his friend carry on their conversation. And later on, the inspector comes back to the house, and Dupin says, are you still looking for the letter? And the inspector says yes, and the reason for this is that this letter also carries with it a huge reward, an astronomical sum of money. And so aside from the ethical and legal issues of solving this case, there's a monetary reward behind it. And they kind of go back and forth. This is one of just the best exchanges. And there will be a little bit of spoilers, so keep that in mind if you haven't read it. It's a fantastic Edgar Allan Poe story and detective story, and it's very easy to recommend. But so we have this tense conversation at the table. There's the inspector saying there's a huge reward, and Dupin saying, how much would you give someone if they were able to produce the letter? And he names a sum, let's say $10,000. And Dupin says, I'm going to hand you a checkbook. You write out a check for $10,000, and I will hand you the letter. And the inspector goes silent, stunned. But with some credulity, he writes out the sum of money, and he puts it on the table. And Dupin opens up a little box, and he pulls out this sought-after Purloined Letter. The inspector is thunderstricken. Speechless, he snatches the letter and escapes out of the house in a terror, in a run. And all of this is happening in front of the inspector and Dupin, in front of the friend who is also sitting there. And so the friend, of course, goes, well, what just happened? How'd you get the letter? What's going on? And so we now retrace our steps, and Dupin explains the flaw in the inspector and in the police force's logic in their attempts to retrieve the letter. And the conclusion, or the resolution, the way in which this case was solved really is satisfying. I'm not going to say explicitly what happens, but it's such a great example of an experience that everybody goes through, and has gone through the ages. When you're in your house and you just misplaced something, and you know it's there, and yet you cannot find it. That's happened to everybody. And there's a mystery there. There's an inherent, deep down wonder of how that could be. It was just in your hand. You must have placed it somewhere, and yet now it is nowhere to be found. And so on Poe's part, I feel like it was just this ingenious idea of taking a relatively common human experience and then transplanting that to be the linchpin of solving a detective case. In this case, there was a robbery. And I think he just pulls it off flawlessly. Dupin comes off as a much more distinct character. His personality feels individual. We really have a better sense of who this person is, compared to his character that was drawn in the Murders of the Rue Morgue. It's a fantastic case, and even though there's a little bit of mumbo jumbo while Dupin is explaining his reasoning, at the end of the day, the conclusion that he came to is still brilliant. So this is a really satisfying, classic, timeless, entertaining detective story that is fun to read for the first time and is also still an absolute pleasure to return to. So this is another Monsieur Dupin detective story, The Purloined Letter by Edgar Allan Poe. Let me know if you've read it. Let me know if you think I spoiled too much. I hope not. It's going to be solved, so that's not really a spoiler. Anyway, leave a comment if you would like, and thank you for watching.